Hi, and welcome to the Sabbath Christian Church's online sermon. God gives great and powerful blessings for those who He saves. Let's take a look at God's salvation. 2 Corinthians 6:1 starts us off and says, "As God's partners, we beg you." Paul reveals to the Corinthians that they are partners with God. Partners in the salvation that God had in mind from the very beginning, knowing that Adam and Eve would not accept Him as their Creator and God. So Paul calls us His partners. I mean, we think of God as our Father, and He is, and the Creator, and He is, and we're in awe and fear of Him. But Paul says that we are partners with God. You know, He's the head of the family, and Jesus is the firstborn, adopted Son of God, and He has put Him in charge of us, under Him, and Paul calls us partners. That's an amazing position to hold. Think about that. That puts a bit of an onus on us, a big onus on us. He says, "We beg you not to accept this marvelous gift of God's kindness and then ignore it." He says, we're partners. We have a gift of God's kindness. He loves us in a way that it's almost impossible to appreciate and understand. We'll see a little bit more of how this powerful love comes into our lives and other ways. He goes on to say in the next verse, "For God says, at just the right time I heard you." Just the right time. This timing is evident in many of the Old Testament people that we know. For example, Moses, at the right time I heard you, the burning bush thing, which we'll get into more of, and Passover. But he says, just at the right time I heard you. So He hears us at the right time. And He sets up the right time for us, because He had us in His mind in the beginning of creation. Just at the right time I heard you. On the day of salvation I helped you. Indeed, the right time is now. Today is the day of salvation. We are saved now. We haven't completed the whole process, but we are saved now. This is the day of salvation. Long day. And the day doesn't have to mean strictly the sunset to sunset. But today is the day of salvation. This is an unbelievably powerful thing for God to tell us and help us and have us know and put us in that position where we are capable of doing things as God's partners if we don't ignore it. It's up to us not to ignore it. The Roman goes on and explains to us, today's the day of salvation, right time is now, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good. But not just for good for, any old way, because most people stop at that part of the verse in Romans. We know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, number one. Show our love by keeping the commandments, one of the ways. To those who are called according to His purpose. So there's a couple of different things there, that all things work for good. For those, first, the love, called according to His purpose. God calls us. When we respond to Him, He calls us Just as Moses responded to the burning bush, then God said to him, this is the way God works. He is interacting with us all the time. He knows where we're at. He knows what we need. He knows the kind of help that we need, when we need it, how we need it, and how to draw us closer and closer to Him and fulfill our destiny as partners of God, the least, our Father in heaven. He says, and for those whom He foreknew, just went ahead of that a little bit there, but He knew us from the very beginning of time. He foreknew us and predestined to become conformed to the image of His Son. God had, as I said before, in mind from the beginning, so that He would, see, He couldn't be the firstborn of many brethren. He says, so that He would be the firstborn of many brethren, unless there were many brethren who wanted to conform and predestined to be conformed with God's help and encouragement and give us all the things that we need to move into that position, or to grow into that position is better put, into the image of His Son. Conform to that, to do what Jesus did. Couldn't do what He did. We could conform to the image, can't do what He did, because He's the one that provided this. He said, and those whom He predestined, He also called, and those He called, He justified, and those He justified, He also glorified. We are partners of God. Salvation is today. All of these things are there. We are not glorified in the body, because that has yet to be changed, and that has to happen. But we are glorified in the mind, and our words, and our thoughts, and everything else respond to the glory of God and show the glory of God in us as we do the things that we are called to do, to be partners with God, to be in the image of His Son. What shall we say for this? He said, those whom He called, He justified. Those whom He justified, He also glorified. And then He goes on and says, what shall we say to these things? He says this, if God's for us, who is against us? This relieves us a tremendous burden. We know that He is going to take care of us under all circumstances. He said, as He said up there in Romans, that all things work together for good. He says, who's against us? Who can be against us? Our partner, our Father in heaven, the great Creator, the awesome one. He said, look at this now. This is so important. This is the crux of the importance of what's happening. He who did not spare His own Son, He didn't spare His own adopted Son, the only one in history that kept all the commandments perfectly and did all that God wanted Him to do. He did not spare His own Son. Once that Son was adopted, at His baptism, God adopted Jesus. And he didn't spare His own Son to have a child that way and to choose the best of the best as His Son. And of course, He was always His Father. And He's always, all the people in the world are His sons because they come from the creation. God formed man in His image. But He didn't spare His first and most important adopted Son, but delivered Him over for us all. He gave up His own Son, allowed Him to be tortured and killed for us all. I mean, this is God's purpose toward us. Full force, full power, full love, everything He could possibly do for us. How will He not also with Him freely give us all things? This is salvation. He has done everything for us, given up everything He could give up for us because of his love and his salvation. If he's for us, who's against us? Amen. And thank you for watching and listening.